Hi everyone, thank you for joining. My name is Muazma Zahid and I'm your host today for this episode of Data Exposed Live. I am joined by amazing folks from my team from Azure SQL and SQL Server. We are going to talk about all the amazing announcements that we have done in the past few months. And this is a live session, so we will take all of your questions. Please say hi to the folks that are joining on the screen here as well. Really excited to get the session started and talk about the amazing announcements as well as take your live questions. We have shared this survey before online and we've got a lot of questions from our worldwide audience. So, going into some of the recent announcements, we've recently announced some amazing stuff in Azure SQL DB side, SQL Server. So, that includes hyperscale serverless, data API builder, SSMA new version, and a few more. And in terms of another set of announcements for our SQL Server side of things, we have announcements in Arc, private link for Azure SQL Managed Instance. We have a license-free standby replica for SQL Managed Instance failovers. That's G8 as well, and a lot more announcements. So for this session, for the next 1 hour, we will take a lot of your questions related to all these announcements and anything that you want to ask from SQL Server side as well as Azure SQL. So get started. We have sent this survey out. You can also send more questions to this link. It is still live. Feel free to add more questions to this. And as we go through this next 45, 50 minutes, we will take those questions as well. So we have got some amazing folks from my team. I have folks from SQL Server. I have folks from MI team, as well as SQL Server and Azure SQL DB side of things as well. We have David Pless, we have Pam, we have Mladen, Davide, Joachim, Arvind, and Jes, as well as we have Andreas from security team who has joined us to answer questions from your side. So let's get started. I'm looking at the questions that were pre-submitted to us. So we've sent this survey out and we've got a lot of great questions. The first question I see is for you, Jes, which is about tools. The question is, will more functionality be added to Azure Data Studio so I can do more of what I did in SSMS?
Uh, Great question. Thanks for starting with me, and welcome to everyone that joined us. Yeah, SQL Server Management Studio has been the de facto tool for SQL Server and Azure SQL for a long time. We've been heavily investing in Azure Data Studio in the last couple of years, and that work continues in the coming months. You might have recently noticed, and if you haven't used Azure Data Studio to try it out recently, please do. We've been putting a lot of work into connections, the ability to uh, connect to different data sources, better options, and more stability, fewer disconnections, fewer error messages. We recently released a big change to our Object Explorer. One of the first things that was requested when the tool was new was the ability to group by schema, much like other database tools allow you to do. We are in the process of previewing the ability to add logins in through Azure Data Studio. And there are other great additions coming to the Object Explorer, the Query Designer, and more in the coming months. So yes, stay tuned for those options. And if you have anything you want to see in Azure Data Studio, please go to the GitHub repo. So that's github.com/Microsoft/Azure Data Studio. Go to the Issues tab, look for what you want. If it's there, upvote it. If it's not, please add it. We rely on your feedback to add features.
Awesome. That's just a lot of things that are coming to Azure Data Studio. I'm really excited about those. On that note of tools, I see another question, which is about what are you doing to do better support new developers in Azure SQL?
I think that improving our extensions for developers in Azure Studio or in Azure Data Studio is one of the big ones. In particular, the SQL package extension. That's a really developer first extension that's in preview, and we're making some improvements too. Uh, we also have been hard at work on implementing SQL bindings with Azure Functions, which is one of our premier projects that we are working on right now. We want any developers that are using Azure Functions to be able to seamlessly connect with their SQL database and both be able to query data out of it and add data to it. And we've also implemented currently in preview the triggers within that. So those are some of our big ongoing efforts for new developers and our tooling.
Awesome. Can you all still hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can still hear you.
Awesome. I don't know what happened, but it just said that my browser lost access to camera. So I'll keep going. Thanks for sharing that, Jess. The next question I have is about the new Go SQL command. I'm really excited about that. The question is, why is it called Go SQL command? Is it a subset of SQL command or something totally different?
All right. Yeah, so you might have started hearing more about Go SQL CMD or the new SQL CMD at SQL Bits and more within the last month. So SQL CMD has been in SQL Server as a command line tool to query your databases for a very long time. It's one of our foundational tools. We developed a Go language-based driver, MS SQL DB, a couple of years ago to bridge the gap between not just different operating systems like Windows, Linux, and also Mac, but also different CPU architectures, AMD 64 and ARM 64. We realized that if SQL CMD is one of the foundational tools, we should also build a Go version of that. So now you can run your SQL CMD commands regardless of what infrastructure you have underlying either your application or your CI/CD pipelines or just whatever laptop you're using to develop and manage. Now we've taken it a step farther. In addition to being a command line tool to query, we've really made it a true modern CLI. We've introduced the ability to download it from all of the popular package managers, such as Winget and Brew. And in addition to that, you can then run a command called SQL CMD create MS SQL. And in that one command, you will get the latest SQL Server container running on your local system. From there, you can restore a backup file to have databases, query them and work them, and you can even stop and start those. So this is going to be a huge step forward for developers working on the SQL. I know Davide himself has been using this day in and day out for the last month.
I can stop using it. It's just amazing.
Yeah, so if you want any more, please check out aka.ms/SQL CMD to see some of the new functionality.
Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, it's really exciting. I've been using it as well for the last couple of weeks, and it's really easy, really fast, and then you can get started absolutely free on your local environment and develop. So really excited about that. Thank you, Jess. Thanks for sharing all the updates. So if you have any tools related questions, please put them in the link. Please put them in the chat from wherever you're watching it from. We are looking at the chat here very actively, and we also have Marissa on the back end who's supporting us today and helping us to get those questions to the amazing folks that we've got from the team. So moving on to the survey that we've already got, I see another question which is related to developers, and I see some folks are saying hi and sending us hearts. So thank you for joining. This question is, if I'm developing a new product, what edition of Azure SQL DB should I select? And probably Arvind, if you want to take this question, that would be great.
Thank you.
Azure SQL DB is the preferred database for a lot of developers, and I think some of the work that Jes alluded to in terms of tooling is only going to make it better. Uh, we do have a variety of choices, as some of you may know, in terms of editions of Azure SQL database. Um, if you were to ask me, I would pick Hyperscale, which is the platform of the future for Azure SQL DB. It is in market, so you can use it today. A lot of the innovations that we are bringing to the product make hyperscale really the preferred choice. A case in point is one of the announcements that was shown earlier in one of the slides, which is the addition of serverless for hyperscale. So with hyperscale, you no longer have to worry about managing your storage. It automatically scales. We currently can support up to 100 terabytes for your database. With additions like serverless for hyperscale, you can take your hands off managing the compute resources that are allocated to your database, whereby in serverless, we will automatically scale your database's compute resources for you. So as you will see a lot of these innovations landing, I think hyperscale is the edition of choice. And you'll continue to see innovations like the recently announced premium series for hyperscale, whereby we give you the best of breed underlying hardware. So you can kind of get the best performance for price ratios. And you continue to see a lot more forward-looking announcements coming out on hyperscale. So yes, in short, I would say pick hyperscale if if you're starting afresh. It's a great platform where you can start and continue to grow without having to worry about the underlying platform. Yeah, it grows as your applications, as your workloads grow. Hope that helps clarify.
Thank you, Arvind. Yeah, that does. And I see a comment in the live chat coming in to ask about the link for the new Go SQL command. And Jess, could you repeat that link for us? We'll try to put that on the screen as well so everybody has it.
Yes, that link is aka.ms/SQLCMD.
Thank you. So thanks, Arvind, for sharing about hyperscale and especially about the newer announcements such as serverless hyperscale. This next question is a different angle of it. Actually, I think we get a lot of questions about monitoring our SQL Server workload. So I will take that to you, Arvind.
Okay.
Is there a way to get the activity monitor or a tool like it to work in Azure SQL Server like it did for non-Azure SQL Server?
Interesting question. Thank you for asking that. The management studio, which is kind of, as Jess alluded to, it's been the de facto standard for administration and management of SQL, the SQL family of products, if you may, over the years. It does support connecting to SQL Server on Azure VM, and you can use Activity Monitor as is. However, I think the question here is specifically about Activity Monitor against an Azure SQL database, such as, for example, the fully managed PaaS offering. There are specific restrictions which prevent us from using Activity Monitor for live, monitoring of the queries which are executing on the Azure SQL database. This is feedback that we are aware of and we will consider addressing in the future. However, for the current point in time, based on current, what we see customers using, we do have a variety of community-based solutions which leverage the inbuilt DMVs, which are provided with SQLDB. There are many scripts out there, some of which include the SP who is active script. There's a few that we have provided as samples in our Tiger toolbox in the past and so on. Those scripts are currently the best option for live monitoring of what's going on with your Azure SQL database. I do want to add, though, that for near real-time monitoring, Query Store in Azure SQL DB is probably the best experience. You can go back in time, so to speak, and take a look at what happened, how query plans changed over time, and then potentially deep dive into the plans themselves and so on. So Query Store provides a lot of insight, and that is fully supported with Azure SQL Database and integrated into the experiences, at least with SQL Management Studio and the query performance insights that is available on the Azure portal leverages the query store behind the scenes. So both of these options could offer you a near real-time experience in terms of diagnosing what's going on with the queries in your database. But we are aware of the feedback around Activity Monitor and Azure SQL Database, and hopefully we will have some thing to share in the future with you all.
Thank you, Arvind. Thanks for sharing that. Really looking forward to that. And I think the next question I see here also that was pre-submitted. It's related, but maybe not. You will tell us. This is about what is suggested way to run statistics and index maintenance on Azure SQL Database with private endpoint.
Thank you for that question. Again, very interesting. And I'm going to kind of paraphrase and read between the lines. I believe the original question, the intent of the question is in an automated manner, because we can always run, these scripts in an interactive manner by connecting to it using Azure Data Studio or Management Studio. I think the question really probably is around automation. I do want to propose two options. One option is to use Azure Automation, which currently supports private endpoint-based connections to services such as Azure SQL DB. So you can have Azure Automation, and it's aware of the private connectivity to your Azure SQL database, and that could be one option. The other in-product option is Elastic Jobs. However, Elastic Jobs, as it exists right now, does not support connectivity to private to servers and databases which are behind a private endpoint. That work is being prioritized, and hopefully, again, I don't want to tease you, but stay tuned. There's work in progress. Hopefully, we will have more specifics to share on Elastic Jobs and private endpoints in the near future. So hopefully that will address the requirement at hand.
Thank you, Arvind. Thanks for sharing that.
Sure, great.
So as we're talking about private endpoints and more of security, so I'll switch gears here and take some questions that we've already got from security aspects of things. So one, I'm really excited about SQL Ledger, and we've seen customers using that. The question that we've got is, will Ledger detect tampering even by a DBA or system administrator, even if they directly change the data in SQL backend? So Joachim, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Muazma. And I have to say we're equally excited about Ledger. So this is one of those great features that we released a little while ago. It's getting some really good attention. The short answer is yes, the data is protected. What happens is each transaction, the results of each transaction will be captured, hashed, and stored in a blockchain-like data structure in SQL. And so transactions will get batched. The hashes are computed, and then the end of the chain, the end of this blockchain can get stored off server, off site somewhere. So Ledger is really a fantastic way to ensure that the data hasn't been tampered with. It doesn't prevent the tampering, but it allows you to at least with certainty detect the tampering. So that's an important distinction. And then just to clarify, also we're seeing now that it's G8, it works in SQL Server. It's available in Azure SQL DB. We're seeing great adoption, and we're seeing almost every month we're seeing new use cases for it. So it's we're seeing it used in the financial industry for auditing. We're seeing it used by companies, supply chain companies, doing multi-party transactions where the trust is decentralized, the data is centralized in Ledger and SQL. So it's really something that's grabbing the attention of our customers, and like I said, we're super excited. So if you have any questions about how to turn it on, which is that simple, you just say Ledger on, and then the Ledger table will be protected, can't be turned off. So that's another another feature of Ledger. So if you have any other questions, you can reach out to Andreas or to myself, and we'll be happy to help you and direct you to the right in the right direction here. So thanks, Muazma, back to you.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And yes, there's a lot of excitement for customers for this. So thanks for sharing that. On the topic of security, we just announced the VBS enclaves for always encrypted in Azure SQL database. So Andreas, do you want to share a little bit more about that, or any of the things that customers should know about that? I think that would be good to discuss.
Sure thing. Joachim can stay here and chime in if I mess things up. No, I won't. Just kidding. All right. So we have this new option to store your or to work with always encrypted, which is using the VBS enclaves, and that's really a very lightweight option in multiple perspectives. It's much easier to set up. It doesn't require any specific hardware. It doesn't require specific regions because it doesn't require the specific hardware. So it's much easier to get started using always encrypted and with the ability of having complex queries thanks to the secure enclaves and so on, because of these lowered prerequisites, basically. So that's I think that's the main part, being independent from any hardware. Joachim, remind me, there was a second point. I don't want to forget about that one.
Yeah, go ahead. I think you're hitting all the right points, Andreas. I think what's also important to understand, it basically, it increases or enhances the family of protection that we have in SQL DB. So customers should think about always encrypted as a family of capabilities that have a range of options and sort of security protection profiles. And what, as Andreas pointed out, what Ledger brings to the what VBS brings to the table here is the flexibility, the fact that it's independent of hardware and you can run it anywhere. Once we deploy it, of course, you can run it anywhere in our data centers, and you get the full power of our VMs, of the hardware. There's no restrictions that you were facing if you were looking at always encrypted based on hardware enclaves. So that's really the big thing, and it has a few other sort of enhancements or benefits in terms of in-place encryption and things like this. What's important to point out, though, is it does not add any additional query capabilities yet. This is something that we're still working on. So the set of supported operations is the same as with SGX enclaves, but it does give you this flexibility now that you don't need to worry about hardware, and it frees you from that perspective. So great performance. I think that's probably the gist of it here.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, Joachim and Andrea. So we talked so far about some amazing questions that we already got in terms of tools, SQL, Azure SQL DB. Switching to the managed instance side of things. So Mladen, if we have a few questions already on this, so let me read some that we have already got. One question that we got is, when will Microsoft equalize the feature base for SQL Server 2022 and SQL MI? For example, Polybase has more capabilities in SQL Server 2022 than in SQL MI, including SQL to SQL Polybase connectivity.
I see quite a few questions. So let me try to address them one by one. So managed instance shares the internal database format with SQL Server 2022. So in terms of SQL engine, there is already equality. This database format compatibility will remain available during the mainstream support period for SQL Server 2022, which is 5 years after RTM. Now, outside of the SQL engine, there are some differences related to the Azure platform that supports SQL MI as a service. This platform actually brings a lot of added value of past service, both for SQL MI and SQL DB. For example, some additional layers of security are provided by SQL platform. Now, coming to Polybase, to Polybase and comparison with SQL Server 2022 capabilities, there are a few of these capabilities that required additional work on this platform layer. And we are now adding these capabilities to MI successfully. For example, CTES, or create external table as select command for writing the results set to Azure Data lake storage. It was available in SQL Server 2022 since RTM, and it's now coming to Azure SQL Managed Instance, specifically for this feature, since it's interesting capability in terms of risk of data exfiltration. We had to add some improvements to the platform to address this risk and strengthen the separation of duties principle. Similar additions for integration of the S3 compatible storage. That's another one capability of Polybase from SQL 2022, which is coming to SQL MI. And then the last question was about SQL to SQL, and I will expand this to SQL to any other relational connection through Polybase. So Polybase connections require a specific provider or driver. And then in platform, in the SQL platform, we need to ensure that the way we host and run these providers cannot impact the security or availability SLA of the platform that we are providing, and that's why it takes some time. But it's all work in progress and can be expected. So,
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. I know there were a lot of questions packed into that one question. So thanks for sharing that. I see another question that was pre-submitted, which is overall understanding the update cycle. And the question says that why the update cycle for Azure SQL Managed Instance is slower than Azure SQL Database.
Oh, so actually, the update cycle is not slower. It's the same. There are updates approximately every month for SQL Managed Instance. But similar to Arvind, let me try to read between the lines or assume what was the underlying question. So if the comment was more about, not all of the functional additions that come to SQL database also come to SQL MI, I would say that this is actually normal because those are two services, even though they share a lot in common. So basically with SQL MI and SQL databases, two services, we try to enable as much customers as we can to start enjoying the benefits of PaaS. SQL MI focuses more on the modernization of the existing applications and SQL Server workloads, whereas SQL DB focuses more on the, let's say, cloud-native applications, cloud-born ones. But please don't take this literal. It's not like either or. So when we decide about the priorities and order of the work, we take this into account. In SQL MI, we traditionally prioritized, this feature parity with SQL Server, and we are very close. We are almost done with achieving this 100% parity with SQL Server, and then we are now turning to the features that where some of them are already available in SQL database. For example, REST API, ability to call REST API from SQL database has been introduced recently, and it's coming to managed instance as well. Some of other features were announced at the same time for SQL DB and SQL MI, for example, approximate percentile recently. So I hope this helped with the update cadence question.
Thank you. Yeah, that definitely helps. I see another question which is coming live. It's the opposite of it. So let me ask that to Davide here. The question is that link server exists in on-site. Will it have an equivalent on Azure database?
Yeah, so on Azure SQL database, there is no equivalent of linked servers. So the closest thing, it's called Elastic Database Query, which allows you to basically connect and query to another Azure SQL database, but it's limited to Azure SQL only. If you really need full linked server support, SQL MI is the service you want to go to make sure that if you are planning to migrate and you are using linked servers, you can land on SQL MI easily and still have linked server support.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that, Davide. So again, if anyone has any questions on the managed instance side of things, please put them in the live chat or in the link that we have shared. We are still looking at it actively, and I'm going back to the ones that were pre-submitted to us. The next area here is SQL Server and SQL Server 2022. So David, over to you. The first question I have is, I have heard so much about the storage engine has improved in SQL Server 2022. From your experience, what are some of the most impactful features?
Okay, so I get to be biased. But there's a lot of field study in what I'm going to say as well. I think I'd say the hands-free TempDB capability was probably the most impactful because of the struggles that DBAs have had for such a long time. In SQL Server 2022, we addressed the GAM and SGAM contention, where concurrent PFS updates were addressed in SQL Server 2019. When I talk about conducting field research, a lot of the pain points that we saw were scalability issues in TempDB, memory scalability limitations, query processing, and some also in the recovery area. And for performance scenarios, a lot of times, we take the approach of just throwing hardware at the problem. But in many scenarios, more hardware could make it worse. And that causes DBAs and developers to try to architect around and develop around limitations. So a lot was resolved in those pain points with SQL Server 2022. Outside of TempDB, I'd say buffer pool parallel scan, accelerated database recovery improvements were the most impactful. We also had a lot of smaller storage engine improvements, but they all add up to just a better, improved experience in SQL Server and Azure SQL for those scenarios.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that, David. I see another question that was submitted, which is what capabilities are on by default and which are the capabilities that still needs to be configured?
Okay. So just getting to SQL Server 2022, what are you able to benefit from just by getting there? And then what are the things that you have to configure? Okay. So two of which I just mentioned actually. Buffer pool parallel scan is on by default. You just need to get to SQL Server 2022. And that feature improves performance of buffer pool scan, especially on large memory machines. Like let's say an Azure SQL M series, something with a lot of memory. Because all of our previous scan operations, anytime you did created a new database, file drop operation, backup restore, failover, whatever, it was always a serial scan prior to SQL Server 2022. So now we're able to take advantage of multiple processors running that scan in parallel. That's on by default. The TempDB improvement I mentioned, concurrent GAM, SGAM, similar to what we did with concurrent PFS updates, that's all on by default in SQL Server 2022. What's not on by default? So usage scenarios, like improvements, I would say, so improvements like the ordered clustered column store index feature, you have to use clustered column store indexes to take advantage of it. So, you get the benefit, but you got to use it to get it. Intelligent query processing improvements. I know this is kind of a QP thing, but I'm going to keep saying it. Folks, get to the latest database compatibility level. That's one of the biggest things that you can do when you move your database from one release to the next. Get to the highest compatibility level you can, and then use technologies like query store hints to help you stay in the highest compatibility level if you've identified a query that regresses. There's a lot to unpack there, but that's something that a DBA has to do with intent. That's something that you are opting into. Accelerated database recovery, that's something that you have to enable as well to get that recovery improvement. So that's something that is an intentional DBA step that has to be taken. So there's a lot just getting to SQL Server 2022 that you're going to be able to take advantage of from a performance scenario. If we could drop the link to what's new in SQL Server 2022, there's just digging in and following the breadcrumbs there would help DBAs and developers understand what do they get on by default and what do they need to configure.
Great.
Also, that was a loaded response, but yeah, that would help. That would help folks, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot of goodness in the SQL Server 2022, so definitely check that out. The intelligent query processing stuff, the things that were mentioned about TempDB. On the topic of TempDB, there was a question that I saw, and I'll read it out. It says that do we still need to worry about configuring the best practices for TempDB?
Yeah. So yeah, I get that at the conferences as well. So I think a lot of this comes from two different demos that we run. I run a demo with a Power BI streaming data set, following all the best practices. showing a load against PFS for older releases and a load for that really drives GAM and SGAM contention. So I'm following all the best practices, 2019 versus 2022, and you really see the impact of that. If you go to, I think it's aka.ms tempdb blog 2. It's blog 2 because Pam had the tempdb blog for the 2019 release. But if you go to blog 2, you'll see that comparison. Bob Ward does a demo where he's not following the best practices, trying to show how impactful the concurrent GAM and concurrent SGAM improvements are. And he's not showing the contention in not following the best practices. But that being said, and Bob says this as well, we're not going to recommend changing the best practices at this point. We don't know. We're going to have to get more feedback from the field, but currently it looks like with those improvements, the best practices that we've been recommending since SQL Server 2000 were always with the intent of avoiding these contention points, these choke points, whether it's metadata contention or it's object allocation contention. A lot of that has been addressed, except you do still need to opt in for the in-memory OLTP improvement that Pam drove in SQL Server 2019.
Great.
So we're talking about what's on by default. That's one that you do still need to do with intent.
Awesome. And then the links are also shared here to learn more about the SQL Server 2022 and also the blog link that was shared right before this. So thanks for sharing that, David. I do see one more question on TempDB before we move on to the other set of questions, which is when should we turn on the in-memory OLTP improvement for TempDB?
Yeah, and another angle on that question is, why not just make it default everywhere? So, so that in-memory OLTP improvement was first made available in 2019, and it's specifically to address metadata contention. So if you see, like, if you're monitoring system OS waiting tasks, and you're seeing like 2, 1, and not 1, 1, 2, or 3, not PFS, not GAM, not SGAM. You're seeing some other number like 118, right? And it's on a system object, and you're seeing a good bit of that. That contention is not going to be addressed by following the best practices, by having multiple files, by taking advantage of the proportional fill algorithm, round robin algorithm. That's not going to address that scenario. That's object allocation contention. Metadata contention is on those system tables. If you're seeing that, you're seeing enough of that, that's when I will say that you do need to opt in, and that's an alter server configuration. You're going to set the memory optimized TempDB metadata. You're going to turn that on, and it's going to require that you restart SQL Server. But I would only do it to address that metadata contention issue.
Great. Thanks for sharing that, and lots of great details there. And then anyone who is listening, I think they can benefit from it. So switching to actually one of the live questions that we just got for SQL on VM. So Pam, you're next. SQLDB can be set up SQLDB we can set up monitoring easily, but how can we set up monitoring for SQL VM natively in Azure?
Thanks, Muazma, and thanks for that question. That's actually a really great question. We get that a lot. So we don't have a native Azure SQL monitoring solution yet. I stress yet, because hopefully coming soon we will have something. But for now, because SQL, when you're running SQL on a VM, you're running it on one of the public VMs. Azure Monitor actually has some metrics that you can monitor. So things like CPU utilization, memory utilization, disk I/O utilization, all of that can be monitored through Azure Monitor and Azure Metrics. And you can build dashboards with those metrics. You can set up alerts and things like that. So Azure Monitor is probably the first step for being able to monitor your VMs. Of course, there's no SQL counters in there. Those are just your basic hardware counters. But we are working on a few different improvements to try to surface some basic SQL monitoring. But of course, all the tools you're used to using on-prem will still work. You can still use Management Studio with Activity Monitor. You can use performance dashboard reports in Management Studio. Some folks, even if they're using SCOM on-prem, they continue to use SCOM in Azure. And by the way, we have management packs that work for SQLDB and SQL MI as well. So if you happen to already have SCOM on-prem, you can just take that to Azure. So those are some of your options. We are working on some native solutions, hopefully in the future. And then one thing I just have to plug anytime someone asks this question is one of the biggest performance issues customers have when they come to Azure VM is I/O throttling or capping, because when you pick a VM in Azure that has a limited amount of IOPS and throughput, and similarly the disks that you're hosting your data files on have a cap on how much I/O throughput they can do, and so those Azure monitoring metrics that I was telling you about, those have some very specific metrics for disk throttling, so you can see whether you're generating more I/O than your VM or your disk can handle. And so I would encourage you to go to, and I'll put this link in the chat as well, so hopefully we can flash it on the screen, aka.ms/SQL IaaS perf. And that is a short URL to our best practices checklist. And a lot of the things that I just talked about are listed there, the Azure Monitor metrics, all of that good stuff. You can find, this is a high-level checklist for everything you should do to get the best perf out of Azure VMs.
Thanks for sharing that, Pam. And actually, there was one question that was pre-submitted. I would not read the whole question because it's pretty lengthy. It was very similar in line, talking about some memory issues, and their free memory is less than 4 GB. And they were also asking about suggestions or best practices for monitoring server memory on a SQL Server Windows machine. So,
oh, right. Yeah, I think I remember seeing that question. So it was about, hey, I have an alert that says my free memory goes below, if it goes below 4 gigs, but I don't know if that's right, right?
yeah.
So, this is a tough question to answer because the best answer is your mileage may vary. It depends, like all those favorite answers we have for SQL Server questions. It depends on your workload. It depends on the system. So if you follow SQL Server setup, we have some suggestions for setting max server memory for SQL Server. And there's a rough rule of thumb. I think that SQL Server shouldn't take more than like 85% of the memory in the server. You should have 15% free. But how much additional memory you need above and beyond what SQL Server uses depends on what else you have running on that server. So maybe you have SSIS packages and those are taking up memory. Maybe you haven't followed our best practices, which tell you don't run analysis services on the same server that you run SQL Server. If you have something that's a memory hog like analysis services, that can be taking up a lot of memory. So how much free memory you should have on the system kind of depends on what you have running. But SQL Server, the more memory you give it in general, the more memory you give it, the better it's going to perform. So we usually recommend that you don't put anything else on the server except SQL Server. Let SQL Server take up to about 85% of the memory. And then you would have an alert. And usually the best alerts you have are based on your own baselines. So watch the system when it's performing well, see how much free memory is available there. And then that becomes your threshold. That's what you monitor. So here's my baseline performance for good performance. Everything's running well. My application's running well. Here's what the system looks like. Those become your baselines. And then you set up alerts if anything wavers from those baselines. So if your free memory drops from that baseline of good performance, that's what you want to alert on. So rather than picking a random number out of the sky, it's so much better to just monitor your system, figure out what your good baselines are, and go from there.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for sharing that. On the note of SQL on VM, there is a question here, which is, are there any recent developments in price performance for SQL Server on Azure VMs?
Price performance, my favorite topic. The answer is yes, always. We're doing so much work in the price performance area. And so we recently published a benchmark, or GigaOM published a performance study for us, showing us in comparison with AWS R5B VMs, better performance, better price performance in general. We also have some new VM series. I've been talking about the double sprinkles VMs, the EBDS v5 VMs. Those have been out for a while now, but we're getting new sizes. So there's a 96 core and a 112 core VM coming out. We have a new storage type called Premium SSD V2, which is really going to be a game changer for both performance and price performance. It has configurable IOPS and throughput, so you can get exactly the capacity you need and exactly the IOPS and throughput that you need for your workload, and you can configure all of that and pay for only what you need. So some really cool stuff coming out. By I would say by the end of June, we should have just the most amazing system you can possibly run SQL Server on. All these good things coming up, and then of course more. We continue to work diligently on the price performance front, and so we'll continue to have innovations coming.
Yeah, thank you, Pam, for sharing. I love that double sprinkle VM. So, thank you. So, switching gears here as well, and I'm just going to check quickly if you've got any new live questions. Please put them. We still have 14 minutes to go. So, if there have any burning questions and you have the amazing experts here, please put them in the chat from wherever you're watching it from. Um, the next question, switching to Azure SQL database, and Davide, this question is for you for Data API Builder.
Yep.
Could you tell us a little bit about Data API Builder and why Data API Builder is only for Azure SQL databases? Name says Azure databases everywhere, so it cannot be used offline.
Yeah. So first of all, Data API Builder is a project we just released a couple of weeks ago and allows developers or DBAs or anyone who needs to turn a database into an API. So it basically allows you to take tables, views, storage procedures, and just make them a REST or a GraphQL API. You just have to set up a configuration file, and then Data API Builder will take care of everything for you, including authentication support, authorization support, so you can publish the data as an API securely. Now, having said that, the name, the full name is Data API Builder for Azure Databases, in the sense that we wanted to stress out that we support all databases in Azure, which means Azure SQL, of course, which implies SQL Server also, and SQL MI, of course, and then Cosmos DB, Postgres, and MySQL. So is for all databases, right? That's why we use the Azure databases, because we want to kind of focus on the fact that we support not only Azure SQL, but all databases that you can run in Azure natively. Having said that, that also means that you can run Data API Builder offline on premises on any of those support databases. So maybe the name is a little bit focused on Azure, but it is actually something you can easily run on premises on your SQL Server, and is actually open source. So you just download, actually it's very easy to download, just do .NET install, and then you will be able to download and install Data API Builder, point it to the database you want to expose as an API, and you're done. You have REST and GraphQL fully supported with pagination, filtering, selection, and sorting. So yeah, the name implies Azure SQL, Azure databases, but is actually all databases that can run on Azure natively. That's the real name.
Awesome. Yeah, and GraphQL and REST for your database objects. That's amazing. So could you share the short URL quickly
Yeah,
here as well, so
absolutely.
folks can go to
Is
it?
AKA, let me keep it, paste it in the chat, but it's aka.ms/DAB. Super easy, and that will bring you to the GitHub repository, because again, I said it's open source, it's released under the MIT license, and then from there you can have access to documentation, all the links with samples. For those who are interested in running Data API Builder in Azure, there is also explanation on how you can run it on Azure, both doing what we call self-hosting, so basically run it in a container, or we integrate Data API Builder with static web apps. So if you really want to build a website that is nicely architected, so you have a front end, the back end, and everything communicates with API, and also the backends communicate with Azure SQL in a nice and correct way, Data API Builder can really save days and maybe even more of your time, because then you just have the API ready and you can use any framework like Vue or React or Angular to communicate with your API in minutes instead of hours or days. So it's pretty nice.
Awesome. That's great. Thanks for sharing that. And the link is right there on the screen as well for anyone who wants to go and try it out. Please do that. Share feedback. There is a question related to that. It is OREDA coming to Data API Builder?
So we didn't talk about OData at the beginning because it seemed to us that GraphQL was the future, right? But we got quite a lot of feedback around supporting OData, so we are evaluating it. We are interested in getting more feedback. And actually, if you go to the link that I just shared, aka.ms/DAB, you can search in the issues, and I will be soon migrating it to the discussion. But basically, the roadmap is published, and there are mentioned to OData. And also there is a discussion forum within GitHub that you can put your idea. And if you think that we should support data, just let us know, because again, the development is done following the open source principles. So the more feedback we get around some feature we need to support, definitely we'll take a look at it. So not for now, but again, if people ask for it, why not?
Awesome. So please share your feedback if you want it, and if you really want to see, definitely go to that link and share that. And one other question related to that is, does DAB support OpenAPI?
Huh. Oh, yes, that's a great question, because they have a good answer for that, which is not yet, but development, since, again, that was a feature that has been immediately requested from the early adopters, is being scheduled to be deployed and delivered in the next 2 months. So it should land in April. In the roadmap we have a schedule with each month what we are going to release. And I think it's already scheduled everything until August. And we are following a kind of a TikTok approach. So every other month we will do a kind of a stabilization release. We just fix bugs and make sure that everything is stable, and a foundational engine is without bugs. And then every other month we then add the features, just like the TikTok principle that has been introduced years ago by Intel.
Awesome. So more to come on that, and please kind of look at the roadmap on that that Davide has mentioned. So there was one question that was pre-submitted, and I think I can take that. That is to tell us about CDC plans. So, by CDC change data capture, that is our feature which went GA in Azure SQL database last year April. I'm assuming the question is overall like what's coming up next, and are we evolving in terms of any next steps into CDC? So yes, we are looking at some of the existing performance related issues and other things to CDC. So CDC is widely used by many thousands of databases have enabled it. From that perspective, we are looking at customer feedback and evolving the next set of plans. And it is going to keep on adding extra features. We have fixed a lot of internal bugs and issues related to it as well. And then in upcoming months, what you will hear is other change streaming type options, or change data capture type options coming to Azure SQL database as well. We also announced Synapse Link last year. So if you want any analytics workload to connect to kind of your transactional system, so that is your option to look at. So Synapse Link, if you don't know about, definitely search on that. It's very easy to set up, and then you can start seeing data in your Synapse workspace. And those are some use cases where we see folks want to take SQL data into other use cases such as analytics or downstream doing actions on it using CDC type technologies as well. So if you have any feedback, please feel free to share that, connect with us. We would like to hear more how you're using these features and what you're doing to make your data state work for your applications as well. So I think we have gone through all the questions that I could see on the screen. I will just quickly check the live chat here as well, if there is anything that is there. So I see one question just popped up. How is Synapse different from Databricks? It's a very interesting question. I don't know if anyone here wants to take that. Arvind, do you want to take a stab at it, or I can try to answer that as well.
I think you can take a stab at it, Muazma.
Yeah. So Databricks is a third-party kind of company, which is we have a first-party kind of relationship with Azure as well. So it's not about what's different. This is another option for you to actually run analytics. So Databricks is supported in Azure as well as another major clouds. So we have Azure Databricks, and Synapse is our Microsoft offering for analytics as well, and you can you can do most of the analytics type workload in Synapse and Microsoft as well. So it's not about what's different. Of course, feature comparative, if you want to do feature level comparison, other things, you can do that depending on your workload. But these are two offerings that you can do, you can use in Azure right now to enable your analytics type of scenario on top of your data, wherever that data is. So that would be kind of how I look at it. And depending on your workload, depending on your constraints, depending on what you're deploying, you can take one or the other, or maybe have use case to use both.
Yeah, Muazma, just jumping in very quickly to mention that we also have a very nice GitHub repository that shows how you can quickly and fastly load data from Azure SQL to Databricks using partitioning and bulk load. So I just posted the link on the chat if we can show it in the screen, because I guess the integration between Azure SQL, which is a kind of operational database, or HTAB database, and Databricks is probably also behind the question. So definitely loading data quickly in Databricks is important, and we have a sample for that.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. And the link is right there. So thanks for asking that question, Benjamin. We have a few more minutes. I see one more question from the live audience. Probably I can take that as well. How can I have a free Azure subscription? So this is something we hear a lot from folks who want to come and try out. So there are a few ways that you can have a free Azure subscription or free Azure offering. From creating a subscription is completely free. So you can go ahead today and create a subscription. It depends on when you actually create the resources, is when you have a certain bill associated with that. So I do want to clarify that you can go ahead and create a subscription today completely free. Now, in terms of if you're a student, so we have Azure for Student offer, which provides you credits to actually use Azure subscription for free completely, as long as you have that student ID or student email associated with your account. So definitely go try out. If you just search on Bing or Google it, Azure for Student offer, you land in the page which will take you, and it takes a couple of minutes to set that up. If you're not a student, and let's say you are a startup, or you have some idea that you want to try it out, then getting started with Azure, we have many free offers. So for example, SQL has a free offer where you can actually get started and create a SQL database and use it if you use that particular SL or particular SKU. So the follow-up is with unlimited resources. So that's really really a fun fun conversation that we would like to have offline. But of course, it has to have some limits in which we can provide free services. We have certain offerings already that provide, as long as you use that particular offer for that limits, that's free forever. But if you want to use kind of some of the other options in conjunction with that, then there is a billing associated with that. So you can get started for free, and definitely look at our local development experience, which is absolutely free. You don't need Azure subscription to try that out. We talked about the SQL CMD. Just mentioned that it's completely free to get started. So there are a lot of great options for you to get started, and that should not hold you back to do what you want to do. So I think we got everything, all of the questions that have came through live chat, and we are just at time as well. That's amazing. So I would like to thank everyone here who's from my team, and my colleagues here from different time zones that have joined here as well. From everyone who is attending and listening to us also, thanks for joining. Thanks for being here. And again, thank you for your time, for asking all these amazing questions. So what's next? So on May the 4th, we will have a Star Wars themed version of the same thing at same time, at same place. It will be May the 4th, be with Azure SQL, and it will be an AMA for similar style. So again, thank you so much for joining. See you next time, and hope you have the great day. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.